9 experienced hikers slice through their tent from the inside with knives. They flee into the Siberian night, temperatures plunging to 50 degrees below zero. Most wear only underwear. Some are barefoot. They run downhill through waist-deep snow, away from their shelter, away from their warm clothing, away from any chance of survival. 3 weeks later, search teams find their bodies scattered across a frozen mountainside. One hiker is missing her tongue. Another has a fractured skull. Several have chest injuries so severe they're compared to car crash victims. And on some of their clothing, investigators detect traces of radiation. The Soviet government investigates for exactly 3 months before closing the case. Their official conclusion? The hikers died from what they call a compelling natural force. They don't specify what that force might be. The files are classified. The area is closed to hikers for 3 years. And for the next 6 decades, the Dyatlov Pass Incident becomes one of the most haunting mysteries in modern history. Tonight, we're going to walk through every detail of what happened on that frozen slope in February 1959. We'll explore the hikers themselves, the journey that led them to a mountain the local Mansi people call Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. We'll examine the evidence that baffled Soviet investigators and spawned countless theories. And we'll consider what scientists now believe may have happened that night, though even the most recent explanations leave questions unanswered. This is a story without easy solutions, without satisfying conclusions. It's a mystery that has generated theories ranging from avalanches to military experiments, from yetis to extraterrestrials. Some of these theories have more evidence than others. Some rely entirely on speculation. What we can do is separate what we know from what we believe, and perhaps find some understanding in the spaces between certainty and conjecture. So settle in. Get comfortable. Because we're about to journey into the heart of one of the 20th century's most enduring enigmas. In January 1959, the Soviet Union was deep in winter. The Cold War gripped the world in tension. Sputnik had launched just over a year earlier, kicking off the space race. Nikita Khrushchev led the Soviet state. And in the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg, a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov was planning an expedition. Igor was studying radio engineering at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. He was known among his peers as serious, methodical, someone who planned meticulously and led with confidence. This wasn't his first trek into the northern mountains. He had experience with difficult routes, winter camping, and the kind of physical endurance required for Soviet Grade 3 hikes, the highest certification available at that time. Grade 3 certification required hikers to traverse at least 300 kilometers through challenging terrain. These weren't casual weekend trips. They were expeditions that tested your limits, that demanded both physical strength and mental resilience. Igor had that resilience, and when he began assembling a team for a winter trek to Otorten Mountain in the northern Urals, he chose people who shared his capabilities. The group would eventually consist of 10 people, though only 9 would continue to the end. Most were students or recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They ranged in age from 20 to 24, with one exception: a 37-year-old sports instructor and World War II veteran named Semyon Zolotaryov, who went by the nickname Sasha. Semyon's presence has fueled speculation over the years. Some have wondered why an older, mysterious figure joined this group of young students. But the explanation may be simpler than conspiracy theorists suggest. According to available records, he was an experienced hiker who had been approved to join an expedition of similar difficulty, and the organizers likely viewed him as additional experience and leadership for the challenging route ahead. The other members of the group included Zenaida Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old radio engineering student known for her cheerful personality. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, studying economics, described by friends as energetic and determined. Rustem Slobodin, 23, engineering student, someone who enjoyed photography and documenting their journeys. Yuri Krivonishenko, 23 years old, whose friends called him Georgi. He worked as an engineer at a closed nuclear facility and had helped with cleanup after the Kishtim disaster in 1957, a nuclear accident that contaminated a large area. This detail would become significant later. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, studying economics, known for his sense of humor. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, an engineering graduate with French ancestry reflected in his surname. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a physics student described as quiet and methodical. And finally, Yuri Yudin, who would turn back early due to illness, a decision that saved his life. These weren't reckless amateurs. They were experienced, physically fit, and prepared for the challenges ahead. The route they planned would take them nearly 200 miles through the northern Ural Mountains in February, the harshest time of year to attempt such a journey. Their destination was Otorten Mountain, whose name is sometimes mistakenly translated as "don't go there" in the Mansi language, though research suggests this translation may be inaccurate, possibly a mispronunciation or mapmaker's error. Still, the mistranslation has added an ominous tone to the story over the decades. On January 23, 1959, the group received their route book, official documentation required for expeditions of this type. They departed Sverdlovsk that same day by train, heading north through the Ural region. Their spirits were high. Photographs from the journey show them laughing, playing around, full of the camaraderie that comes with shared adventure. They arrived in Ivdel on January 25th, a town at the northern edge of Sverdlovsk Oblast. From there, they took a truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before entering true wilderness. This was the jumping-off point. Beyond Vizhai, there would be no villages, no roads, no help if something went wrong. On January 27th, they began their trek. The weather was brutal from the start. Temperatures hovered around -30 degrees Celsius. That's -22 Fahrenheit. The wind cut through even the best winter gear. Snow lay deep across the landscape, making every step an effort. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was experiencing severe joint pain and sciatica, chronic conditions that flared up in the extreme cold. He knew he couldn't continue, so he said goodbye to his friends and turned back toward Vizhai. The photograph of that goodbye shows them smiling, embracing. No, one knew it would be the last time Yudin would see any of them alive. The remaining 9 continued north. Their diaries and cameras documented the next few days. They skied across frozen landscapes, through forests of birch and cedar, over terrain that grew progressively more challenging. Despite the harsh conditions, their diary entries remained upbeat. They even created a little handwritten newspaper they called The Evening Otorten, filled with jokes and observations about the journey. In one entry, they joked about snowmen, a light-hearted reference that some conspiracy theorists would later twist into evidence of Yeti encounters, though it was clearly just humor among friends. By January 31st, they had reached the edge of a highland area. Following standard procedure for long expeditions, they cached surplus food and equipment in a storage spot they called a la base, supplies they would pick up on the return journey. This was smart planning. It reduced the weight they had to carry and ensured they'd have provisions for the trek back. On February 1st, they began ascending toward the pass. This was where things started to go wrong, though not in any way they could have anticipated. The weather deteriorated rapidly. Snowfall increased. Visibility dropped. Strong winds kicked up ground snow, creating whiteout conditions. In this environment, navigation became extremely difficult. Even experienced hikers with compasses could lose their sense of direction. It appears they did exactly that. Instead of crossing the pass and descending to a forested valley on the other side, their intended route, they veered west and found themselves climbing the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. The name, depending on translation, means either dead mountain or refers to an area lacking game for hunters in the Mansi language. Either way, it wasn't a welcoming place. When they realized their mistake, Igor Dyatlov faced a decision. They could descend about 1.5 miles to reach the forest, where trees would provide shelter from the wind and firewood would be readily available. But that meant losing all the altitude they'd gained, altitude they'd have to climb again the next day. Alternatively, they could camp where they were on the exposed mountainside and continue in the morning. Igor chose to camp on the slope. This decision has been debated endlessly by researchers. Some believe it showed poor judgment. Why camp in such an exposed location? Others argue it made sense from a mountaineering perspective. They would maintain their altitude and the route ahead would be easier. There's also speculation, based on Yuri Yudin's later comments, that Igor wanted to challenge the group by practicing mountain slope camping, a valuable skill for Grade 3 certification. Whatever his reasoning, they set up camp on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl that afternoon. Photographs taken from their cameras show them cutting into the snow to create a flat platform for their tent. This was standard procedure on slopes. You dug into the mountainside to create a level surface. The tent went up. They secured it with ski poles and other equipment. The last photograph, taken sometime before sunset, shows a figure standing near the completed tent against a gray sky. Sunset on February 1st at that latitude occurs around 5 in the evening. We can reasonably assume they had the tent set up by then, giving them time to prepare dinner, settle in for the night, and rest after a difficult day of skiing and climbing. What happened after that is where certainty ends and mystery begins. On February 12th, Igor Dyatlov had planned to send a telegram to the sports club in Sverdlovsk, confirming their safe return. The club expected the message might be delayed. Several days late wasn't uncommon on expeditions of this difficulty. When February 20th arrived with no word, concern began to grow. By that point, the families of the hikers were becoming worried. They pressured the Institute to take action. On February 20th, the first search teams were organized. These initially consisted of student volunteers and teachers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, people who knew the missing hikers personally, who understood both the urgency and the technical challenges of searching in winter mountains. As days passed without finding any trace of the group, the search expanded. Military personnel joined. Police forces were mobilized. Helicopters and small planes were dispatched to fly search patterns over the northern Urals. The vast, snow-covered wilderness made finding anything extremely difficult. Miles of forest, endless ridges and valleys, all buried under deep winter snow. On February 26th, a search party that included a student named Mikhail Sharavin made a discovery. They spotted something orange poking through the snow on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. As they approached, they realized it was the corner of a tent. The group's tent. What they found at that campsite baffled everyone who saw it. The tent was partially collapsed and covered with snow. But it wasn't weather damage that caught their attention. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Long slashes had been made through the canvas with knives, cuts made by people trying to get out, not by someone trying to get in. Inside the tent, they found nearly all the group's belongings: warm clothing, boots, food, a flask of vodka. Everything you would need to survive a winter night in the mountains. The arrangement suggested the hikers had been settling in for the evening. Some items were neatly organized, others scattered as if abandoned in haste. Outside, leading away from the tent down the slope, they found footprints. These tracks told a disturbing story. Some prints showed bare feet, others showed feet covered only in socks. A few showed single boots. The tracks led downhill toward the forest, roughly a mile away. Something had caused these experienced hikers to cut through their tent and flee into sub-zero temperatures without proper clothing or footwear. Whatever it was, it must have seemed more dangerous than certain hypothermia. Search teams followed the footprints down the slope. On February 27th, about 300 meters from the forest edge, they found the first body. It was Igor Dyatlov, the expedition leader. He was lying face up in the snow, head pointed back toward the tent. His arms were clenched across his chest. His jacket was unbuttoned. He had made it partway back up the slope before succumbing to the cold. Not far away, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova. She too appeared to have been trying to return to the tent. She was farther down the slope than Igor, positioned as if she'd collapsed while climbing. The same day, about a mile from the tent near the forest edge, searchers found two more bodies under a large cedar tree. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko lay near the remains of a small fire. They were dressed only in underwear. The cedar tree above them showed broken branches up to about 15 feet high, suggesting someone had climbed it, possibly to see back toward the tent, or perhaps to break off dead wood for the fire. Both bodies showed signs of hypothermia, but there were strange details. Krivonishenko had third-degree burns on his legs and hands. Medical examiners would later note that these burns were too severe to have occurred if he'd simply fallen asleep near the fire. He would have woken from the pain. More disturbing, he appeared to have bitten off a piece of his own knuckle. The flesh was found in his mouth. On March 5th, search teams found the fifth body. Rustam Slobodin was discovered between the cedar tree and the tent, positioned as if he too had been trying to return to the shelter. But unlike the others, Rustam had a small fracture in his skull. The injury wasn't severe enough to be immediately fatal, but it raised questions. How had he sustained this trauma? These first 5 deaths were officially attributed to hypothermia. The medical examiner noted that their bizarre behavior, fleeing the tent, removing clothing, apparent disorientation, was consistent with severe hypothermia. There's a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia victims feel hot and remove their clothes in the final stages before death. The broken skull and other minor injuries could potentially be explained by falls on ice or collisions with trees in the darkness. But 4 bodies remained missing. As spring arrived and snow began to melt, the search continued. In early May, a Mansi hunter working with search teams discovered a trail of cut branches in the forest. Following this trail about 50 meters from the cedar tree, they found something unexpected: the entrance to a snow den. The hikers had attempted to dig a shelter into a deep snowbank in a ravine. On May 5th, they excavated the site. What they found inside would deepen the mystery exponentially. 4 bodies were buried under nearly 12 feet of snow. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignollet, and Semyon Zolotaryov had taken refuge in this improvised shelter. But unlike the first 5 victims who died from exposure, these 4 had suffered catastrophic injuries. The autopsies, performed on May 9th by medical examiner Boris Vozrojdeny, documented trauma that shocked investigators. Lyudmila Dubinina had massive chest fractures, multiple ribs broken on both sides. Her tongue was missing. Both her eyes were gone. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol's had severe skull fractures. Semyon Zolotaryov had chest trauma with numerous rib fractures. Alexander Kolevatov had similar, though less severe, injuries. The medical examiner stated that the force required to cause such injuries was comparable to a car crash. These weren't injuries from a fall or a fight. Something had applied tremendous blunt force to their bodies. Yet there were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises on the skin. The damage was entirely internal. Adding to the strangeness, some of the clothing on these 4 bodies had been cut from the first victims who died. They had taken garments from Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, the 2 found by the cedar tree, and fashioned additional layers. This suggested these 4 had survived longer than the others and had the presence of mind to attempt to increase their insulation. But perhaps most disturbing to those following the case were 2 additional findings. First, some of the clothing worn by Alexander Kolevatov and Lyudmila Dubinina showed traces of radioactivity. Second, there were reports, unverified but persistent, of orange spheres seen in the sky that night by other hikers about 30 miles away, and by witnesses in nearby towns during February and March. The lead investigator, a prosecutor named Lev Nikitich Ivanov, found himself unable to explain what had happened. The evidence didn't fit any standard scenario. There were no signs of an attack by other people, no footprints except those of the 9 hikers. The Mansi people, who were initially considered as suspects, were peaceful and had no motive. More importantly, the medical examiner stated explicitly that the injuries to the 4 in the ravine could not have been inflicted by human beings. The force was too great. No soft tissue damage accompanied the internal trauma. After 3 months of investigation, in May 1959, the case was officially closed. The conclusion stated that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. No specific force was identified. No guilty party could be found. The files were classified and sent to secret archives. The area where the incident occurred was closed to hikers and skiers for the next 3 years. No official explanation was ever given for this closure, adding fuel to speculation that authorities knew more than they were willing to share. In the decades that followed, the Dyatlov Pass incident became embedded in Russian culture as an unsolved mystery. The mountain pass where they pitched their final camp was renamed Dyatlov Pass in honor of Igor and his team. A memorial was erected near the site, and theories about what really happened multiplied. Some of these theories were grounded in reasonable analysis of available evidence. Others ventured into speculation. A few dove headfirst into conspiracy and the paranormal. It's worth examining several of the most prominent explanations, while being clear about which aspects are supported by evidence and which rely on conjecture. The avalanche theory was actually proposed early in the investigation, then dismissed for decades before being reconsidered. The initial reasoning for dismissal seemed sound. When search teams found the tent on February 26th, there was no evidence of an avalanche, no debris field, no damaged trees. The slope angle appeared too gentle for a typical avalanche. The tent was standing, albeit damaged, not buried under tons of snow. But some researchers noted that the hikers' behavior, cutting through the tent and fleeing in panic, was consistent with an avalanche or the immediate threat of one. If they believed a massive slide was about to bury them, they might have cut their way out and run for safety, planning to return once the danger passed. However, this theory struggled to explain the severe internal injuries of the 4 found in the ravine. A typical avalanche would have buried the entire camp or swept people down slope. It didn't explain why only 4 had such extreme trauma, while 5 others died of hypothermia with minimal injuries. The theory of military involvement has persisted for decades. The area of the northern Urals where the incident occurred wasn't far from classified Soviet facilities. The Kishtim disaster in 1957 had contaminated areas of the region. Some have speculated that the hikers stumbled upon a military test, perhaps of weapons, aircraft, or other classified projects. The presence of radioactivity on some clothing seemed to support this theory. Could the hikers have been exposed to something dangerous? However, as mentioned earlier, Yuri Krivonishenko had worked on cleanup after the Kishtim disaster. His clothing, and possibly Lyudmila's, could have retained contamination from that earlier exposure. The radiation levels detected weren't high enough to be immediately lethal or to explain their deaths. The orange spheres reported in the sky that night have fueled speculation about military tests, UFOs, or other unusual phenomena. It's worth noting that these reports came forward years after the incident, not during the original investigation. Some were second-hand accounts. The reliability of these sightings is difficult to verify. Military activity in the region was real. The Soviet Union conducted various tests in remote areas, but no evidence has emerged linking any specific military operation to the deaths. If there had been a weapons test that went wrong, it's unclear why authorities would close the case rather than conduct a more thorough investigation, even if classified. The theory of an attack by the indigenous Mansi people was considered and quickly dismissed by investigators. The Mansi are a peaceful people with no history of violence against outsiders. More importantly, there were no footprints at the scene other than those of the 9 hikers. The nature of the injuries, particularly the massive internal trauma with no external wounds, didn't match human combat, and there was no apparent motive. Some have speculated that perhaps the hikers violated sacred Mansi territory, or inadvertently offended local customs, provoking a response. However, this remains pure speculation with no supporting evidence. Some have theorized that Mansi people might have used drums or created frightening sounds to scare the hikers away from a sacred area, which could explain panic but wouldn't explain the physical trauma. This scenario seems unlikely given the lack of any evidence of other people present, but it remains a theory some consider possible, though without substantial support. Animal attacks were considered. The region is home to bears, though bears hibernate in winter. Wolves exist in the area, but wolves don't typically attack groups of humans, and they certainly wouldn't cause the type of internal crushing injuries found on the 4 in the ravine. The missing tongue and eyes on Lyudmila Dubinina could potentially be explained by scavenging animals. Bodies left exposed for months would naturally attract wildlife that might consume soft tissues. This explanation has been accepted by many researchers as the most likely reason for these particular injuries. Infrasound theory emerged from researcher Donnie Icar's book, Dead Mountain, published in 2013. This theory proposes that specific wind conditions interacting with the mountain's topography created low-frequency sound waves, infrasound, that humans can't consciously hear, but which can cause intense psychological and physical effects. Some research suggests infrasound can induce feelings of panic, fear, and disorientation. According to this theory, strong winds creating a phenomenon called a Kármán vortex street over the dome of Kholat Syakhl generated infrasound that bombarded the tent for hours. Eventually, the psychological pressure became unbearable. The hikers fled in panic, not from any visible threat, but from an overwhelming sense of dread they couldn't explain. The theory is interesting and explains the panicked flight. However, the scientific evidence for infrasound causing such extreme reactions is debated. Studies have produced mixed results, and crucially, infrasound doesn't explain the massive physical trauma suffered by 4 of the hikers. Paradoxical undressing, a real phenomenon where severe hypothermia victims feel hot and remove clothing, explains some of the strange details. The disorientation caused by hypothermia could explain why some tried to return to the tent but couldn't find their way in the dark. The fire-building attempt shows rational thinking in the early stages. The construction of the snow den demonstrates organized group survival efforts. But paradoxical undressing occurs in the final stages of hypothermia, typically right before death. It doesn't explain why they left the tent in the first place. Yeti or other cryptid theories have been proposed, usually by those predisposed to believe in such creatures. These theories lack evidence. The footprints leading from the tent were all human. No physical evidence of any unknown creature was found. The joke in the hikers' handwritten newspaper about snowmen referred to themselves, not to actual mysterious beings. Government conspiracy theories suggest the Soviet authorities knew exactly what happened and covered it up. The classified files, the quick closure of the investigation, the 3-year ban on the area, all of this feeds suspicion of a cover-up. However, classified files were eventually released after the Soviet Union collapsed. While some pages were missing, the available documentation has been published online. Nothing in these files suggests authorities had a clear explanation they were hiding. The more likely explanation for the quick closure is that investigators genuinely had no answer. Soviet bureaucracy had little tolerance for unsolved mysteries. In the absence of a guilty party and with no clear crime committed, closing the case as death by natural forces allowed everyone to move on. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation. Andrei Kuryakov, the prosecutor assigned to the case, conducted a new review of evidence. After examining various theories, he concluded that a delayed slab avalanche was the most likely explanation. A slab avalanche is different from a typical powder avalanche. Instead of flowing snow, it involves a cohesive slab of compacted snow breaking away and sliding. These avalanches can occur on slopes gentler than those required for powder avalanches. They're harder to detect afterward because they often leave minimal visible traces. Kuryakov theorized that when the hikers cut into the slope to create a platform for their tent, they destabilized the snowpack. Hours later, additional snow transported by strong katabatic winds accumulated on the slope above their tent. Eventually, a slab released and struck the tent while they slept. The impact might not have been immediately life-threatening, but it created panic. Believing a larger avalanche might follow and bury them, they cut through the tent from inside and fled to what they thought was a safe distance. Once away from the tent, they faced a terrible choice: return through the dark and cold to retrieve proper clothing and risk another avalanche, or wait where they were and try to survive. They chose to wait. They started a fire. They built a snow shelter. They attempted every survival technique they knew, but the extreme cold, combined with inadequate clothing, made survival impossible. The four in the ravine, according to this theory, were inside or near their snow den when it collapsed. The weight of snow falling from above caused the crushing injuries. Or perhaps they fell into the ravine in the dark. The medical examiner noted the injuries were consistent with a fall from significant height onto a hard surface. The theory explains most of the evidence: the panicked flight from the tent, the attempt at organized survival, the distribution of injuries. It doesn't require any unusual phenomena, just a combination of bad luck, difficult conditions, and an understandable misjudgment about the threat they faced. However, many researchers remained unconvinced. The slope still seemed too gentle. There was no debris field, and the delay between making camp and the hypothetical avalanche seemed improbably long. In 2021, two Swiss researchers published a study that provided scientific backing for the avalanche theory. Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzerin, specialists in snow mechanics, used computer modeling to demonstrate how a delayed slab avalanche could have occurred. Their research showed that cutting into the slope and removing snow created an area of weakness. Katabatic winds, dense cold air flowing downhill, could have transported additional snow to the area above the tent. This snow accumulated over several hours. Eventually, the combination of the cut platform, accumulated snow, and the specific angle of the hidden slope beneath the surface snow created conditions for a slab release. The study, published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment, used advanced modeling and even drew on techniques developed for animating snow in Disney's film Frozen to accurately simulate snow behavior. Their simulations showed that a relatively small slab avalanche hitting people lying flat in a tent could cause severe chest and skull injuries without leaving external wounds, exactly what the autopsies documented. To verify their findings, expeditions to the site in 2022 confirmed that the area is indeed avalanche-prone. Fresh slab avalanches were observed on the slopes above where the Dyatlov group camped, occurring under similar wind and snow conditions. The Swiss study doesn't claim to solve every aspect of the mystery. Gomez and Puzerin acknowledge that without survivors, complete certainty is impossible. Their work simply demonstrates that a delayed slab avalanche is physically plausible and matches the evidence better than any previous explanation. Some questions remain unanswered. Why didn't they retrieve clothing once the immediate danger passed? Perhaps they couldn't find the tent in the dark. Snow conditions and wind could have obscured it quickly. Perhaps the avalanche had buried or damaged it beyond use. Perhaps they were more disoriented than their survival attempts suggest. Why did some attempt to return to the tent while others stayed by the cedar tree and later in the den? This likely reflects individuals making different judgments about survival strategy. Some may have felt strong enough to attempt the climb. Others recognized they wouldn't make it. The missing tongue and eyes on Lyudmila Dubinina continue to disturb people. However, her body was found months after death, exposed to the elements and accessible to wildlife. Scavenging animals naturally consume soft tissues first. eyes and tongues are particularly vulnerable. While this explanation is prosaic, it's supported by forensic science and makes more sense than ritualistic mutilation or exotic weapons. The radioactivity, as discussed, likely came from prior contamination exposure through Krivonishenko's work. The levels weren't high enough to be lethal or to explain the deaths. The orange spheres remain unverified and unexplained. If they occurred, they could have been unrelated natural phenomena, military activity in the broader region, or simply stories that grew in the retelling. What we're left with, after 65 years of investigation, speculation, and scientific analysis, is a tragedy that can be largely explained by natural causes without requiring conspiracy or the paranormal. 9 skilled, experienced hikers made a decision to camp on an exposed mountainside in extreme weather. This decision, while debatable, wasn't reckless by the standards of Soviet mountaineering. They took precautions. They used proper technique. They had experience, but they may have unknowingly created conditions for a delayed avalanche. When a slab of hard snow hit their tent hours after they'd settled in, they made a rapid decision to evacuate. This decision, made in darkness and possibly in confusion from being struck while sleeping, led them away from their survival gear. Once separated from adequate clothing in negative 30-degree temperatures with high winds, their time was limited. They did everything they could, built a fire, constructed shelter, attempted to return for supplies. But the combination of extreme cold, physical trauma from the avalanche, and distance from their gear proved fatal. It's a story of how quickly things can go wrong in mountain environments. How a series of small factors, a navigation error, a weather system, a slope angle, wind patterns, timing, can combine into catastrophe. It's a story of human vulnerability against natural forces that don't care about our plans or our skills. The Dyatlov Pass Incident captured public imagination because it seemed to defy explanation. The combination of bizarre details, the cut tent, the missing clothing, the mysterious injuries, the radiation, the reports of lights in the sky, created a perfect storm of mystery. Each detail added to the sense that something extraordinary must have occurred. But extraordinary events don't always require extraordinary explanations. Sometimes, as the saying goes, when you hear hoofbeats, it's horses, not zebras. Sometimes the truth is just that nature is powerful and human judgment, no matter how experienced, can fail. This explanation may disappoint those who prefer more exotic theories. It doesn't involve secret weapons or alien encounters. It doesn't confirm conspiracy theories about government cover-ups. It's a story of ordinary people facing ordinary dangers in an extraordinary environment and making decisions that, in hindsight, proved fatal. Does this mean the case is definitively solved? Not entirely. The Swiss research provides a plausible mechanism, verified by computer modeling and field observations. The Russian investigation concluded avalanche was most likely. But science deals in probability, not absolute certainty. Without survivors, without time travel, we can't know with 100% confidence exactly what sequence of events unfolded on that slope. What we can say is that the slab avalanche theory, as refined by recent research, accounts for more of the evidence with fewer assumptions than any competing explanation. It doesn't require unknown phenomena. It doesn't demand conspiracy. It needs only the laws of physics, the behavior of snow, and the reality of human psychology under stress. For the families of the 9 who died, the scientific explanation provides something valuable: closure. For decades, relatives wondered if their loved ones had suffered, if they'd been victims of something sinister, if the government had hidden the truth. The avalanche theory, while tragic, confirms that the hikers weren't victims of malice. They were victims of nature and circumstance. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member who turned back and survived, spent the rest of his life seeking answers. He participated in expeditions to the site. He spoke with researchers, journalists, and investigators. He died in 2013 at age 75, before the Swiss study was published, but after decades of witnessing theories come and go. One hopes that the recent scientific work would have given him some measure of peace. The Dyatlov Pass Incident reminds us that nature doesn't need to be supernatural to be deadly. The mountains, the cold, the snow, these are powerful forces that humans have learned to navigate but never truly control. We prepare, we train, we calculate risks, and usually we succeed. But the margin for error is thin, and when multiple factors align badly, even the experienced can find themselves in situations beyond their ability to escape. Tonight, on that slope in the northern Urals, snow still falls. The memorial to the 9 hikers stands silent. Occasional expeditions visit the site, retracing their route, trying to understand what those final hours must have been like. The tent location has been identified with reasonable certainty. The cedar tree still stands, or at least stood until recent years. The ravine where 4 were found remains a somber reminder of how the landscape itself can become deadly. The story of Igor Dyatlov and his 8 companions has been told in books, documentaries, films, and video games. It's inspired horror stories and conspiracy theories. It's become part of Russian folklore, a cautionary tale told around campfires, a mystery discussed in hushed tones. But at its heart, it's a story of 9 real people. Young people with families, with futures, with dreams and plans. They were students studying engineering